Why was everyone staring at her? The room had been alive with laughter only moments before, crystal glasses clinking, brass medals glinting under chandeliers, and the kind of easy arrogance that comes when heroes gather to celebrate themselves. But all of it went still the moment the colonel spoke. "Tell me," his voice echoed through the ballroom, low and amused, "who invited that?" The words hit the air like a crack of thunder, sharp, mocking, deliberate. Heads turned, conversations faltered, and for the briefest second even the orchestra stopped playing. Near the back of the hall stood a woman, alone, unmoving. Her uniform, if one could still call it that, was faded, olive-drab utility fabric, creased and threadbare, carrying no visible rank, no ribbons, no insignia. Just a single small patch on her shoulder, a hawk gripping a lightning bolt, stitched so subtly most had missed it entirely. She didn't flinch, didn't shift her weight. She just stood there, spine straight, chin level, the stillness of a soldier trained to wait through far worse than ridicule. Her name, though few here knew it, was Corporal Vance. "Are you lost, soldier?" Colonel Finch asked again, his lips curling in amusement. "Or did you mistake this gala for a field exercise?" A few guests chuckled, nervous, eager to align themselves with power. Others pretended to look away, unwilling to challenge a man with a chest full of ribbons. The colonel's decorations gleamed like a mirror of his ego, each medal a story he never stopped retelling. But tonight he had found a new story, one standing quietly at the back, refusing to vanish. The colonel's laughter spread like a contagion. Even those who didn't join in shared the unspoken agreement. She didn't belong here. Yet remained silent. She clasped her hands before her, her thumb brushing the rough seam of her sleeve, a habit old and grounding. It kept her from reacting, from remembering too much. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum, thick, breathless. The air conditioner hummed somewhere above the chandeliers. Somewhere near the stage, a general cleared his throat, and yet no one moved to defend her. Because in that glittering room, perception was power, and her plain uniform screamed weakness. The colonel stepped closer, his polished shoes clicking against the marble. "This event," he said, gesturing broadly, "is for those who earned their uniforms, Corporal." He let the question dangle. "Vance," she said quietly. Her voice carried, soft but steady, like the calm before a storm no one saw coming. "Corporal Vance," he repeated with mock courtesy. "Well, Corporal Vance, this isn't a forward operating base. This is a celebration of valor. You understand the difference." A ripple of polite laughter moved through the room again, weaker this time. People wanted this moment to end, but no one dared end it. His gaze didn't leave his. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. The colonel tilted his head, amused by her composure. "Then tell me," he said, "is this uniform meant to honor your service, or is it simply the only thing you own?" The words were cruel, pointed, and they worked. A few guests gasped, others smirked. Felt the familiar sting, not the insult itself, but what it represented. She had lived through years of this in subtler ways. The half-glances, the underestimation, the invisible wall between those who had seen real battle and those who only toasted it. Her silence deepened, and that silence, calm, unyielding, only seemed to provoke him further. Across the ballroom, her friend, the reason she had come, looked on helplessly from one of the front tables, had been invited quietly, humbly. Her friend was receiving an award that night, a silver star for valor. Hadn't wanted to come at all. Crowds weren't her world anymore. Not since Helmand, not since that night. But when her friend insisted, "You should be there, Ara, you earned it too," she couldn't say no. And now, standing in that sea of laughter and light, she regretted every step that had led her here. The colonel took another step closer. "You're not even wearing a nameplate," he said, his tone sharp now. "And that patch," he pointed toward her shoulder, "that's not regulation. I could have you escorted out of here." He wanted to see her crack, wanted the satisfaction of control. But didn't move, not even a blink. In the corner of the room, A young lieutenant whispered to his date, "Maybe she's one of those discharged types, couldn't handle it out there." His date stifled a laugh. But near the bar, a gray-haired general leaned forward, squinting at the faint Hawken bolt patch. His hand paused mid-sip. That symbol. He had seen something like it before. Not in open briefings in black reports, the kind that arrived unmarked, burned after reading. He said nothing, just watched. Could feel every gaze on her now. Her pulse thudded in her ears, but her face remained composed. Still. Controlled. She had stood like this before, on windswept radio headset crackling, trying to sound calm while mortars fell a few hundred meters away. She had learned back then that fear could be tamed. You just had to give it a mission. But this moment, this humiliation felt different. Because out there, she had known who the enemy was. Here, the enemy wore medals and smiles. "Perhaps," said another officer, trying to sound diplomatic, "she's here as a guest. Maybe she misunderstood the dress code." That earned a few nods, a polite out. Could have taken it. Could have smiled, apologized, pretended she'd made a mistake. It would have ended the moment, spared her the stares. But that wasn't who she was. She looked at the colonel again. "This uniform is my dress code, sir," she said quietly. "It's the only one that matters to me." It wasn't defiance, it was truth. And truth, in rooms like this, was dangerous. The colonel's jaw tightened. "Your service, you said, and where exactly did you serve, Corporal?" Hesitated, not out of fear but calculation. There were things she could never say, missions that didn't officially exist, places erased from maps. "Afghanistan, sir," she replied simply. The colonel chuckled, shaking his head. "We all served there, Corporal, try again." He turned toward the audience, gesturing to the amused officers seated around him. "I spent 2 years in Kandahar, real combat. What about you, Corporal? A field desk, communications tent." More laughter, but not from everyone this time. The general near the bar was still watching her. His eyes were narrow now, calculating. The truth was she had worked communications, but not in any tent, not in any base. Her hands, now steady at her sides, still bore faint scars from shrapnel burns, scars she never covered. She remembered the smoke, the stench of cordite, the weight of silence after the gunfire stopped, and the voice in her headset, broken, desperate, calling for extraction that never came. That night had never left her. Neither had the name of the operation, Resolute. But no one in this room would ever understand what that meant. Not yet. The colonel smirked, taking a step back, arms folding. "Nothing to say, I thought so. You see, ladies, and this is what happens when standards—" "Sir," her voice cut through the air. It wasn't loud, but it stopped him mid-sentence. "I was invited," she said, her words deliberate, calm. "By Sergeant Hill, I'm here for her." Her friend, Sergeant Hill, froze, tears threatening behind her eyes. The colonel blinked, momentarily thrown off by the composure in her tone. "Invited," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "Yes, sir," she said. "And this uniform," she glanced down briefly, "is the uniform of my service." There was no arrogance, no pleading, only fact. But that was enough to twist the knife. The colonel laughed again, forced, cruel. "Your service, 30 years in uniform, and I've never seen that one." Her eyes flickered for the first time, a shadow of memory behind them. 30 years, she thought. 30 years of medals, speeches, dinners. And not one night in the mud. But she didn't say it. Because silence had always been her weapon. The laughter returned in uneasy waves. Guests looked around, wondering if they should still be amused. Some weren't. Something in her tone, her composure, unsettled them. On her wrist, beneath the rolled cuff of her sleeve, the faintest tattoo caught the light, a trident entwined with lightning. Not decorative, functional, a mark of belonging, or once belonging. Only one man in the room noticed it, a Navy lieutenant commander who had just stepped in late, still in his own dress blues. He froze mid-stride, eyes narrowing on the mark. His expression changed, confusion, then something else. Recognition. But he didn't speak, not yet. Exhaled slowly. Around her, the murmur of the room shifted again from mockery to discomfort. Her heart thudded once, then steadied. She'd seen this look before, in and debriefing rooms. People realizing they might have misjudged her, but not ready to admit it. And beneath the noise, the orchestra started again, a slow piece that somehow made the humiliation worse. The strings filled the silence no one dared to break. Somewhere behind her, a whisper. "What's that patch mean?" "Probably fake, she's bluffing." Still, she didn't even flinch. His gaze softened. For a moment she saw not the chandeliers or the mocking smiles, but sand the color of dust at dawn, the faint hum of rotors overhead, a transmission line crackling through her earpiece, the voice she'd promised she'd never forget. Then, like a reflex, she pushed it away. "Not here, not tonight." The colonel straightened his cuffs, satisfied that the moment was ending. "Well, Corporal," he said, turning toward his table, "consider this a lesson in presentation. Next time you attend an event of honor, dress accordingly." But before he could finish the sentence, reached up to her collar. Her fingers unclasped a small, dull metal coin that had been hidden beneath the fabric. She turned it slowly in her palm, the movement almost invisible. For her, it wasn't defiance. It was grounding, a memory of those who hadn't made it back. The coin's edge caught the light, a faint engraving, a single word, worn but legible. Resolute. And beneath it, a line of numbers, coordinates. She closed her hand around it again, silent, waiting. There were things she could say, but not yet. In that glittering hall of medals and mirrors, surrounded by men who thought they knew what courage looked like, Corporal Vance simply stood her ground. Quiet, composed, fading into the background once more. But something had shifted. The laughter was dying now, replaced by unease. The colonel, for the first time that night, couldn't quite meet her eyes. And somewhere, near the edge of the room, a SEAL lieutenant commander whispered under his breath, just loud enough for himself. "No way, it can't be her." He took a step forward. But that would come later. Why didn't she just leave? That question rippled through the crowd like static, soft but contagious. Every path to the exit was open, yet Vance remained rooted in place, one hand still wrapped around that dull metal coin, her thumb tracing the worn letters as if the touch alone could keep her steady. The colonel had turned his back on her now, his laughter already dissolving into another conversation. But not everyone followed his lead. A few officers kept glancing toward the woman in the faded uniform, caught between curiosity and discomfort. Something about her silence unsettled them, the calm of it, the weight of it. From the edge of the ballroom, the SEAL lieutenant commander kept watching too. His name, though no one spoke it yet, was James Miller. He had arrived late, almost unnoticed, his dress blues immaculate, the trident gleaming above his ribbons. He'd expected another night of speeches and polite applause. But the moment he saw the Hawken bolt patch, the coin, the scar along her jaw, his world tilted. He'd seen those symbols before. Not in briefings. In nightmares. At the far end of the hall, the orchestra changed tempo, the gentle strings melting into something darker, more solemn. The colonel pretended not to notice. He was already trying to reclaim the room's attention, laughing too loudly at another officer's joke. Yet the laughter fell flat. The atmosphere had shifted, fragile and uneasy. Vance didn't move. She could feel the tremor in her hand now, not fear exactly. Something older, the memory of adrenaline that never really leaves the body. Her gaze wandered across the polished floor, the reflections of medals and shoes, the small universe of people who believed valor could be measured in applause. She thought of the men and women who never stood in rooms like this, who didn't come home, and for a heartbeat, guilt flickered through her. Why am I even here? Then she heard a voice. Not from the stage, not from the colonel. From behind her. "Ma'am," a soft, uncertain whisper. Turned slightly. A young private, barely 20, stood there clutching two champagne flutes. He looked terrified of the colonel, of the crowd, maybe of her. His voice shook as he spoke. "I just wanted to say thank you for standing your ground." Her brow lifted a little. He didn't know who she was. He just knew courage when he saw it. She gave a small nod. "Thank you, soldier." The private smiled awkwardly and disappeared into the crowd. It was a small moment, gone in seconds, but it anchored her, reminded her why silence was sometimes louder than anger. Colonel Finch caught the exchange from across the room. His smile faltered. He couldn't let the narrative slip. Pride, that dangerous addiction, pushed him forward again. He raised his glass. "Ladies and," he called out, "a toast to discipline and to the standards that make this uniform mean something." The crowd, half confused, half obliging, echoed a polite murmur of "hear, hear." But not everyone joined in. Some kept glancing at the woman who had been humiliated yet hadn't broken. Miller finally moved. He set down his glass and began walking toward her, slow, deliberate steps across the marble floor. Each footfall seemed to echo louder than the music. He wasn't sure what he'd say, only that he had to say something. As he approached, turned slightly, sensing him before she saw him. Her eyes, calm, unreadable, met his. For a moment, neither spoke. He saw it then, the fine lines of exhaustion near her eyes, the subtle burn marks at her wrist, the way her stance was always balanced, ready. This wasn't a mistake. She wasn't lost. She was trained. "Ma'am," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "where did you get that coin?" She studied him for a moment. The trident on his chest caught the chandelier's light. Navy SEALs, she'd worked with them before once, a lifetime ago. "Why do you ask?" she said. "Because I've seen one like it," he replied, his tone suddenly careful. "Operation Resolute is that." Didn't answer. Her eyes flickered, a storm behind restraint. Then she closed her fist around the coin and said softly, "Some stories aren't meant for ballrooms." Miller drew in a slow breath. That was all the confirmation he needed. Behind them, the colonel noticed their exchange. His face hardened. "Lieutenant Commander Miller," he barked, his voice slicing through the music, "is there a reason you're fraternizing with someone out of uniform?" The crowd tensed. The orchestra stopped again. Miller turned, his expression calm but his eyes cold. "With respect, sir," he said, "she is in uniform." The colonel snorted. "You're defending this farce now. Don't tell me you buy into her story." "It's not a story," Miller said. Something in his tone, the steel, the conviction, silenced even the laughter. A few heads turned between them, sensing a collision of ranks. The colonel forced a smile. "Careful, Lieutenant Commander. You might forget who's in charge here." Miller's voice dropped. "I haven't forgotten, sir, have you?" The words landed hard, and for the first time, Colonel Finch didn't have an immediate comeback. Wanted to stop it. This wasn't her battle. She didn't need defending, but part of her knew that silence couldn't carry everything forever. "Sir," she said softly to Miller, "please, it's not worth." "It is," he interrupted. "You shouldn't stand alone." Their eyes met, two soldiers bound by something unspoken. She saw in him the same weariness she carried, the same ghosts. The colonel exhaled sharply. "Fine," he said, feigning patience. "Since you're so convinced, perhaps you'll explain to the room what unit uses that ridiculous insignia." Miller hesitated. His training screamed secrecy. JSOTF-17 wasn't to be discussed, not here, not anywhere. But the way she stood there, small, silent, humiliated before a crowd that pretense made the choice for him. "Sir," he said finally, "that insignia belongs to a Joint Special Operations Task Force, Resolute." Gasps rippled through the hall. The colonel blinked, confused. "Never heard of it." You wouldn't have, Miller said. Most haven't. The murmurs grew louder now, a wave of questions rolling through the tables. The general at the bar set his glass down slowly, realization dawning. The whispers became names, half-remembered briefings, blacked-out files, the legends no one ever confirmed. His jaw tightened. She hadn't wanted this. Not here, not like this. But the words were out. Miller looked back at her. You were there, he said quietly. Weren't you, Hellman, the downed crew, the coordinates? Her hand trembled, not fear, memory. In her mind, the ballroom vanished, replaced by sand and smoke. The sting of grit in her eyes. The ringing in her ears after the explosion. Her voice over the radio breaking, this is Resolute 3. Target jammer destroyed. Repeat, jammer destroyed. Then silence, and the heavy sound of rotors slicing through the dark. The mission no one was supposed to survive. Back in the ballroom, the colonel's smirk was gone. He looked between them, bewildered, defensive. You expect me to believe this woman was part of? Miller turned to him sharply. She wasn't part of it, sir. She was the reason it succeeded. His words hit the air like a thunderclap. The whispers stopped. Closed her eyes for a moment. The noise, the lights, the memories, it all pressed in at once. She wished he hadn't said it. She'd never wanted recognition. The mission had already cost enough. Miller continued, his tone steady but charged with emotion. I flew the extraction that night. We were supposed to land blind, no comms, no coordinates. We thought everyone inside that compound was dead. Then we got a transmission from a handheld set, encrypted in a pattern only one unit used. It guided us straight in. He looked at her. Her transmission. The colonel's face drained of color. Around the room, the officers who had mocked her earlier sat frozen. The elegant woman who'd laughed about fashion choices lowered her gaze. Felt exposed, the weight of memory and attention heavy on her chest. She wanted to vanish into the floor. But another part of her, quieter, older, simply breathed through it. This isn't about you, she reminded herself. It never was. Miller turned back toward the colonel. Sir, if you've ever heard of Objective Griffin, that was her. Without her, 23 Allied soldiers would have died in that valley. She ran comms under fire, hacked enemy frequencies with half her equipment destroyed, and stayed on the ground until every one of us lifted off. He paused, his voice softening. She was wounded during refused until the last man was aboard. The colonel said nothing. His jaw worked silently. His metals seemed suddenly heavier on his chest. The room was deathly still now, no music, no laughter, only breathing. Opened her eyes and looked around, faces she'd never met, now filled with shame, awe, confusion. She wanted to tell them to stop starring, that she wasn't a legend. She was just someone who'd done what had to be done. Instead, she whispered, it was a team effort. Miller smiled faintly. That's what everyone from Resolute says. In the silence that followed, the weight of truth settled over the crowd like dust. The colonel lowered his gaze. The same man who had mocked her now couldn't meet her eyes. And yet there was no triumph in her expression, only quiet sadness. She lived long enough to know that recognition often came too late. Miller straightened, his voice calm again. Sir, with your permission, he said, I'd like to correct an earlier mistake. The colonel didn't answer, couldn't. So Miller turned toward, took one deliberate step forward, and raised his hand, the perfect, deliberate salute of a Navy SEAL to a fellow warrior. The room froze. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. No one spoke. No one dared. And as Miller's salute hung in the silence, Vance finally exhaled, slow, steady, eyes bright with the ghost she carried. How long does a salute last? A second, two. Or long enough to change everything? Lieutenant Commander James Miller's hand remained raised, unwavering, deliberate, the salute of a soldier to another. Not to rank, not to protocol, to honor. The ballroom, once filled with laughter and glass and music, now hung in perfect silence. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the soft shifting of someone's dress, the crackle of the microphone left on at the podium. All eyes were on them. The woman they had mocked standing motionless in her faded, patched uniform, and the SEAL officer before her, his salute drawn with absolute precision. His eyes locked on hers, his expression solemn, almost reverent. In that instant, no one breathed. Colonel Finch stood frozen beside his table, one hand halfway to his glass. He didn't understand what was happening, or maybe he did, and couldn't bear to accept it. He'd spent a lifetime reading uniforms, learning the language of ribbons and medals. But here was a uniform that broke all his definitions, stripped of decoration, yet carrying a presence that silenced a room full of generals. Miller's voice finally broke the stillness. "Permission to speak freely, sir," he said, eyes still forward. The colonel swallowed. "Granted." Miller lowered his salute slowly, deliberately. His voice dropped to a tone that carried not authority but truth. "Corporal Vance," he said, "served with the Joint Special Operations Task Force 17. Resolute." Gasps rippled through the crowd like electricity. Someone near the stage whispered, "That can't be real." Another officer muttered, "JSOTF 17, that's the ghost unit." And an older general, his voice hoarse, said simply, "Oh my God." Miller continued, "You won't find their names in any public record. You won't see their missions on any official list, but their work saved lives, including mine." He looked at again. "She wasn't just part of Resolute," he said. "She was resolute." Her jaw tightened, discomfort flickering through her. She didn't want this, the spotlight, the myth-making, the reverence. She'd seen what hero worship cost. It always came too late. Still, she didn't interrupt. There was too much history between those words. Colonel Finch opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. He looked smaller now, the weight of his own arrogance pressing down on him. His voice, when it finally came, was thin. "That unit," he said, "that was classified." "Yes, sir," Miller said, "for good reason." He stepped forward slightly, his tone softening, becoming almost reflective. "The operation she mentioned earlier, those coordinates on her coin, 34 north, 67 east, that was Objective Griffin." A hush swept through the room. Everyone had heard whispers of Griffin, a rescue mission deep in Helmand Province, a downed aircraft, dozens of soldiers presumed dead. A story that ended in success, though no one had ever known how. Until now. Miller's eyes grew distant, his voice taking on the rhythm of memory. "I was flying one of the extraction birds that night. We were told to prepare for heavy casualties. No comms, no coordinates. The mission was practically suicide." He paused, the words dragging something heavy out of him. "Then we got a ping, a narrowband signal hand-coded. Someone had bypassed enemy encryption with a pattern only our side used, the Resolute cipher. A woman's voice came through, calm, precise, directing us to an exact grid." He turned to, "It was yours." A murmur swept the room, disbelief, awe, shame. Said nothing. She only met his gaze, eyes distant, haunted. The colonel's face was pale now. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, the pomp drained from him. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "this woman, a corporal, coordinated that mission?" Miller nodded once. "She did more than that, sir. She broke an enemy signal chain under fire, held her position for 3 hours. She got every man out alive." His voice lowered, thick with restrained emotion. "And she never told anyone." For a long moment, no one moved. Shifted her stance slightly. Her fingers brushed the edge of her sleeve, the faint ridge of scar tissue beneath. The mark she'd stopped trying to hide years ago. "I wasn't alone," she said softly. "We were a team." Miller nodded. "We all were, but you were the one who stayed behind when the line went dark." Her eyes flickered, the memory sharp as glass. She could still smell the smoke, hear the static, the world narrowing to the sound of her own heartbeat and the voice of the pilot she'd promised to get home. Miller's voice. She hadn't known it was him until now. The colonel stepped forward slightly, his tone faltering. "Corporal Vance, why didn't you ever? Why keep it hidden?" Looked at him for a long moment, her voice steady but soft. "Because not everything done in service needs to be seen," she said. "Some things are meant to stay quiet." The colonel's throat bobbed. His chest, usually puffed in self-assurance, seemed to collapse a little. "Quiet doesn't mean forgotten," she added gently. "It just means we carried it so others didn't have to." The crowd was utterly still. A few civilians wiped at their eyes, uncertain why exactly, maybe shame, maybe awe. A few officers stared at their own medals, suddenly aware of how light they felt. Miller turned toward the colonel once more. His voice was lower now, calm but cutting. "Sir, I believe an apology is in order." Finch's face flushed. For a moment, pride battled decency, old habits warring against new understanding. But then something in him cracked. The weight of his own arrogance fell heavy. He took a slow breath and nodded once. "You're right," he said quietly. He stepped forward until he stood before. The ballroom watched, the same eyes that had mocked her now waiting, expectant, ashamed. "Corporal Vance," he began, his voice thick. "I was wrong, deeply wrong. I judged what I could see and ignored what I couldn't understand." He hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I owe you an apology and a salute." He straightened his spine, shoulders trembling slightly as he raised his hand, slow, deliberate, humbled. The colonel, the man who had laughed at her uniform, now stood before her in respect. A ripple passed through the crowd. A general rose from his seat following suit, then another, then a major, then the admiral near the back. One by one, like a tide rolling in, every uniformed officer in the ballroom stood and saluted. 100 hands raised to brows. 100 eyes fixed on a single woman standing alone in olive drab. No orders, no commands, just an instinct, the recognition of something, then rank. Didn't move at first. She wasn't sure she could. The moment was too large, too heavy. She had spent years being invisible. Now the same world that had ignored her was starring, saluting, honoring. Her throat tightened. She forced a slow breath, grounding herself in the weight of it all, the lights, the silence, the ghosts. Then quietly she nodded. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't revenge. It was peace. The applause started hesitantly, one pair of hands, then two. Then the sound spread, growing until it filled the entire hall, shaking the chandeliers, echoing off marble walls. But it wasn't celebration, it was confession. A sound of respect, long overdue. Miller lowered his salute and stepped closer. "You didn't deserve what they did," he said softly. Looked at him, eyes glassy but calm. "None of us did," she replied, "but that's not why we serve." He smiled faintly, still humble. "Still learning," she said. The colonel turned away for a moment, eyes glistening. Pride was a strange thing. It could blind, it could break, but sometimes, if shattered the right way, it could teach. When he faced her again, his voice was softer than anyone had ever heard it. "Corporal Vance, you've reminded me of something I forgot a long time ago." She tilted her head slightly. "What's that, sir?" "That the uniform doesn't make the soldier. The soul does." A faint smile crossed her lips. "Yes, sir." As the applause faded, the room settled into a reverent stillness. No one spoke. No one wanted to. The music resumed quietly, a low, slow melody, heavy with emotion. Stood still, the lights reflecting off the faint tears she didn't bother to hide. For once, she didn't feel out of place. For once, she didn't need to explain. And for the first time in years, she felt seen, not as a mystery, not as an anomaly, but as what she had always been. A soldier. That night would be remembered not for its speeches, not for the awards but for a single silent moment, when a faded uniform reminded the decorated that humility, too, is a form of valor. And in the echo of that applause, amid the shimmer of glass and gold, Vance finally let herself breathe. The mission was over. The war, at least for tonight, was done. Why does applause sound so empty when it's finally for you? The ballroom still echoed with it, rolling across marble and glass, but Vance only heard her heartbeat, slow, steady, unreal. People were standing, cheering, clapping until their hands reddened. Yet in her mind, the sound was fading, replaced by rotor blades and radio static from a night long ago. She gave a polite nod, a faint smile, then stepped back from the crowd. The noise followed her like a tide receding, fading with every step toward the exit doors. Lieutenant Commander Miller tried to speak, "Corporal, wait," but she only shook her head quietly, kindly. "Enjoy the night, sir," she murmured. "It's theirs, not mine." Then she slipped out. The hallway outside was cold. Long corridors of polished stone and framed portraits of heroes, all staring at her as she passed. Men in perfect posture, uniforms immaculate, eyes forever frozen in that expression of duty. She wondered how many of them had felt fear. How many had heard a friend's final breath. How many had come home and never really arrived. Her boots, old, softened by years of sand and rain, made no sound on the marble. She paused at a window looking out over the city lights. The reflection stared back, the same face she saw every morning but somehow older now, lined not with age but with memory. Behind her, the muffled sound of laughter rose again in the ballroom, the crowd moving on, as crowds always do. And finally exhaled. Outside, the air hit her lungs like water after a long drought, cool, sharp, cleansing. She stepped into the night, away from the marble, away from the chandeliers. The street was nearly empty. Somewhere far off, a siren wailed. Closer, a car rolled through puddles left by an afternoon rain. She reached into her pocket and took out the coin again. Resolute. The engraving had faded, but she didn't need to read it. Every mark, every scratch on its surface was a map of memory. She turned it once in her fingers. Then the world blurred, and she was back there. Dust. Smoke. The heat so thick it clung to her skin. Helmand Province, years earlier. Operation Resolute. Objective Griffin. The desert at night was colder than anyone ever expected. Wind cut across the valley like broken glass. The compound ahead burned dimly, a silhouette of ruin against the starlight. And through the darkness, her voice had been the only one on the net that hadn't shaken. "This is Resolute 3, she whispered into the headset. "Signal jammed, fallback frequency 12.7, copy." Static, then a reply faint and broken. "Copy barely. We're pinned, 2 hostages alive, need coordinates." Crouched behind a slab of concrete, laptop balanced on her knee, the glow barely enough to see. Her hands were bleeding, a shrapnel cut along her thumb, but she typed anyway, rerouting, tracing, decrypting enemy chatter line by line. Her commanding officer had gone down minutes earlier. Half her team was missing. But she couldn't stop. "Vance," someone hissed beside her, Corporal, wide-eyed, his weapon trembling. "We have to pull back." She didn't look up. "If we pull back, they die. There's 20 hostiles in that compound." "There were," she said quietly, "before the—" He blinked. She keyed her mic. "Hammer 1, coordinates incoming. 34 north, 67 east. Confirm visual." "Confirm," came the distant reply. "But that's danger close." "Do it." A pause, then, "Copy, impact in 60." Stared at her, speechless. She just kept typing, rerouting the signal to open a gap for the extraction birds. When the first explosion hit, the shockwave tore dust through the air like a scream. She didn't flinch. 30 minutes later, she was still there, headset cracked, laptop dead, antenna bent. But the jamming tower that had blocked all comms was gone, destroyed by the she'd called in on her own coordinates. She remembered hearing the rotors before she saw them, the deep, rhythmic thump of salvation coming through the smoke, and the voice over the radio, strained but steady. "Resolute 3, this is Eagle 2. We have eyes on you, pop smoke." That voice Miller's. She'd smiled then, the first time in days, even as bullets cracked through the dirt inches from her boots. She never told anyone how close it had been. How she'd dragged to the LZ half-conscious, or how the blast had cut a line beneath her ear, the scar she still carried. She never told anyone how many didn't make it out. Back in the present, the wind brushed her face. She blinked, the memory dissolving, the city lights sharpening again. Leaned against the stone railing, letting the night settle around her. For the first time in years, she let herself remember not the mission, but the silence that followed it, the debriefing she wasn't allowed to attend, the medals handed to others, the quiet discharge papers that arrived without a word of thanks. And now, years later, the same uniform they had dismissed had been saluted by the same kind of men who once looked past her. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like release. The doors behind her opened softly, footsteps. She didn't turn. She already knew who it was. "You always leave before the speeches," Miller said. She smiled faintly. "Some habits never die." He stepped beside her, resting his hands on the railing. For a long moment they just stood there, two silhouettes against the city's glow. "You saved us," he said finally. She shook her head. "We saved each other." He exhaled, watching her profile, calm, tired, somehow lighter now. "You know," he said, "when I saw you in there I didn't recognize you at first. Then I saw that patch and it all came back." "Helmand?" she asked. He nodded. "Every night I fly I still hear your voice. Hold line, repeat, hold line. I thought you were dead." She smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "A lot of people did." Silence stretched between them, not awkward, not heavy, just honest, the kind of silence soldiers understand. After a while Miller spoke again. "They'll probably write about tonight," he said. "Make it a headline, turn it into a story about redemption." She chuckled softly. "Then they'll miss the point." "What is the point?" "That you don't serve for applause," she said. "You serve because someone has to." He looked at her, studying the lines of her face, the calm strength in it. "You're not coming back, are you?" "No," she said quietly. "That part of me's done." He nodded slowly. "Then what now?" Turned the coin over in her hand once more, the engraving catching the streetlight. "Now," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, "I try to live like the people who didn't make it out." A cab passed, its headlights washing briefly across them before the street fell back into darkness. Somewhere above, a flag stirred in the night breeze. Miller straightened, his tone softer now. "You know, when I saluted you in there, it wasn't just for that mission." She glanced at him. "Then what for?" "For reminding me why I joined in the first place." Their eyes met, the unspoken weight between them both heavy and freeing. Then she pocketed the coin and said simply, "Good night, Lieutenant." He nodded. "Good night, Corporal." She walked away, boots echoing softly on wet pavement until the city swallowed her silhouette. Miller stayed where he was, watching the place she'd vanished, the faintest ghost of a smile on his face. Inside, the gala had already resumed. The laughter was back, though softer now, touched with humility. Colonel Finch sat alone at his table, drink untouched, medals gleaming faintly under the dim light. He thought about every soldier he'd dismissed, every name he'd forgotten, and for the first time in years he felt something heavier than pride. Regret. He stood slowly, eyes drifting toward the door she'd exited. Then he whispered to no one, "Thank you." No one heard it. Except maybe the walls, and maybe that was enough. Outside, miles away, reached the quiet of her small apartment. The walls were bare except for one framed photograph, A group of men and women in dusty fatigues, faces half hidden by helmets and dirt. She ran her fingers over it, tracing the edges of the ones who were gone. Then she hung the coin beside it, not as a trophy but as a promise. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the empty chair across from her. For a long time she didn't move. The world outside buzzed and glowed and carried on the same as always. Then she whispered, "Rest easy." And for the first time in years, she slept without dreaming. What does courage sound like? Not the shouts, not the explosions, not even the orders barked through static. Courage, Vance once learned, is the sound of someone whispering through the dark, "I'm still here." Helmand Province, 3 years earlier. The night was moonless, the kind of black that swallowed light, swallowed thought. The desert wind carried sand like a hiss of static, crawling into everything: clothes, weapons, lungs. Crouched low behind a shattered wall, headset pressed tight against her ear, her breathing was shallow, controlled. Every sound mattered, every whisper could mean discovery. Resolute 3, a voice crackled in her earpiece, broken by interference. "Jammer's still active, can't reach air support." "I know," she whispered back, "working on it." She glanced to her left. Corporal lay on the ground, a tourniquet wrapped around his thigh, blood dark against the dust. His face was pale, jaw clenched. "You still with me?" she asked. He nodded weakly. "I'm good, just finish it." Her laptop flickered again, the battery icon flashing red. She wiped a film of sand off the screen with her sleeve and began typing. Her fingers moved fast, faster than most could think. Her mind was a web of frequencies, codes, intercepts. Signals danced across the spectrum, and she hunted for the one frequency she could twist to her will. "Enemy patrol 2 o'clock, whispered a voice on the comms, Sergeant Hale. "The team's last forward gunner. 5 tangos closing." "Didn't look up, don't engage, stay dark." "We're about to be engaged." "Not yet." Her hands didn't stop moving. She rerouted a burst signal, overriding a captured radio node. The screen flashed green, decrypted. Finally. "There you are," she whispered. "Resolute 3, this is command," came a garbled voice, faint but clear enough now. "Status." She pressed her mic. "We've got wounded, jammer nearly down. I can open a narrow channel for extraction." "Copy hostages." 2 confirmed, both alive, holding East Compound. "Roger that, bird on standby, ETA 20 minutes. Exhaled brief relief. Then gunfire erupted downrange. Tracers sliced through the dark. "Contact," Hale's voice. "They found us." Grabbed her rifle and swung toward the sound. Shadows flickered across the compound walls. She fired once, twice, controlled bursts. One target dropped. Another returned fire, the bullet chipping concrete beside her cheek. Groaned behind her, "Vance, go, leave me." She ignored him. "You're not dying here." She slung her rifle and crawled toward him, dragging his arm across her shoulder. He was heavier than she remembered, dead weight, breath ragged. She half dragged, half pulled him toward the broken stairwell. Then the world exploded. The blast threw her backward. She hit the ground hard, ears ringing. The screen of her laptop shattered beside her, sparks sputtering out. The jammer tower, or what was left of it, toppled, flaming, its signal finally silent. "Vance, Vance, do you copy?" Command's voice burst through the headset, clearer now. "Signal open, repeat, signal open." She blinked, dazed, tasting blood. "Copy, jammers down." "Good work, extraction inbound, hold position." She looked around. The compound was chaos, smoke, flames, gunfire echoing like thunder. Hale's voice screamed through comms, then cut off mid-sentence. And then she heard it through the haze, the faint chop of rotor blades. "Air support." But they couldn't see through the smoke. She tore a red smoke grenade from her belt, yanked the pin and threw it high. It arced once, then landed in the open, glowing crimson against the ash. Her headset crackled again. "This is Eagle 2. We have visual. Who the hell's still on the ground?" Keyed her mic. "Resolute 3, 2 wounded, need immediate." "Copy Resolute 3. Mark confirmed, hold tight." She dragged toward the open field, each step a blur of pain and will. The heat from the burning tower licked at her back. Her vision blurred. The world felt distant, hollow. "Almost there," she muttered, half to herself. "Almost there." His voice was fatting. Don't waste." She stopped him. "Shut up." He smiled faintly. "That's an order." "Yeah." A shadow dropped from the sky, the helicopter's underbelly cutting through smoke. Ropes fell, boots hit dirt. SEALs moved fast, clearing a perimeter, weapons sweeping. A figure ran toward her, helmet off, eyes wide. It was him. Lieutenant Commander Miller. "You're alive," he said, disbelief cutting through the noise. "Mostly," she said, coughing. He grabbed his other arm, hauling him toward the LZ. "We thought you were gone." "Not yet," she said. "I had work to finish." Bullets zipped past. Miller shouted orders, his voice rising above the chaos. "Load the wounded. Move." Pushed into the chopper and turned back toward the compound. Miller caught her arm. "Where the hell are you going?" "The hostages." His eyes widened. "They're gone. You'll die in there." "They're not gone," she said, pulling free. "They're east compound. I heard them." He hesitated, every instinct screaming no, but something in her tone froze him. That voice. Calm, absolute. The same voice that had guided his team through hell before. He nodded once. 30 seconds, then we pull you." Sprinted through the smoke, every breath searing. The east compound was half collapsed. She kicked a door in, weapon raised, found 2 men inside, bound, coughing, terrified. "U.S. Army," one croaked. She nodded. "You're coming home." She cut their binds, pulled them up, and led them out. The chopper was still there, Miller covering the perimeter with his team. They stumbled aboard. A bullet grazed shoulder, spinning her sideways, but she didn't stop. She shoved the last hostage in, then climbed up as the bird lifted off. Miller reached down, grabbing her wrist, hauling her in just as the ground exploded beneath them. The blast wave rocked the chopper, dust and debris scattering across the desert below. For a moment everything was just sound. Engines, wind, heartbeats. Then silence. Inside the cabin lay pale but breathing. The hostages were alive. Hale was gone. Sat against the wall, holding pressure to her shoulder, staring at nothing. The coin, still pinned to her uniform, was warm against her skin, marked with the coordinates they'd escaped from. Miller looked across at her. "You just saved 23 people." She met his gaze, voice flat. "We lost 5. He didn't argue, he just nodded. After a long pause, he said quietly, "When we get home, they'll pin stars on us for this." She shook her head. "Not on me." "Why not?" "Because this mission doesn't exist." And it didn't. Not officially, not on record. Within weeks the files were sealed, the commendations redirected, the soldiers scattered to new assignments, told never to speak of Resolute again. And Vance, who had held the line, cracked the code, and stayed until the last man left the ground, was discharged quietly 6 months later. No ceremony, no medal, just a folded paper, a handshake, and silence. Back in the present, she stood again at her apartment window, the faint hum of city traffic below. The memory had faded, but the ache never did. She picked up the photograph on her desk, the one with her unit taken before the mission. Their faces were young, smiling, sunburned. Hale, Rivers, all of them frozen in that moment before everything changed. She set the photo down gently, her reflection merging with theirs in the glass. Then she whispered the names one by one under her breath. A kind of prayer. A kind of promise. The coin caught the city light again, its worn surface gleaming faintly. The word Resolute was almost faded now, the edges smooth from years of touch. But the coordinates beneath were still sharp. She thought of Miller the way he'd saluted her, not for glory but for truth. And for the first time in a long time, she felt something close to peace. Maybe courage wasn't the sound of battle. Maybe it was what came after, the quiet breath of someone who survived, whispering, "I'm still here." Vance smiled faintly at the thought, then she turned off the light. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint hum of traffic, the city alive and unaware. Somewhere miles away, another ceremony was starting, another round of applause, another speech. But she didn't need to hear it, because her war had already been fought. And her silence, her quiet, unshakable dignity, had already said everything that needed to be said. When pride breaks, it doesn't shatter loudly. It cracks in silence. Colonel Finch sat alone in his office, long after the gala had ended. The laughter was gone now, replaced by the soft tick of a wall clock and the hollow hum of the air conditioner. His uniform jacket hung on the back of his chair. His medals, once polished to perfection, looked dull under the lamp's amber light. He stared at them for a long time, the ribbons, the names, the small engraved plaques that marked his distinguished service. And then slowly, he whispered to the empty room. What was it all for? He had built his career on order, on image, on believing that the system rewarded merit, not accident, rank, not silence. But the look on Vance's face that night, calm, patient, unflinching in the face of ridicule, had shaken something loose in him. He had seen soldiers die. He had buried friends. But he had never felt small before. That night, watching 100 officers salute the woman he'd mocked, Finch had realized something that gnawed at him still. All his ribbons told stories of service. Hers told stories of sacrifice. And the difference between those two words kept him awake. He poured a drink, a whiskey neat, but didn't touch it. Instead, he opened the top drawer of his desk and took out an old letter. It was yellowed at the edges, written in his father's rough handwriting. Remember, son, uniform or not, every soldier answers to something higher than command, conscience. He'd forgotten that once, until she reminded him. The next morning, Finch walked through the rain toward the Veterans Center downtown. His step was slower than usual. He'd memorized the address Miller had given him after the gala, a quiet facility that helped discharged soldiers reintegrate into civilian life. He hadn't told anyone where he was going. Some things didn't need announcement. He stopped at the front desk. The woman there looked up. "Can I help you, sir?" He nodded. "I'm looking for Corporal Vance." The woman's expression softened. "She's in the workshop down the hall." He followed the sound of tools, steady, rhythmic, patient. And then he saw her. Was sitting at a workbench, sleeves rolled up, grease on her fingers, fixing a small drone that looked like it had seen better days. Around her, other veterans worked quietly, repairing radios, tinkering with machines, sharing coffee and unspoken understanding. For a moment, Finch just watched. No uniform, no medals. Just people surviving, living, trying. Then she looked up. "Colonel," she said softly. No anger, no surprise, just acknowledgement. "Corporal," he said, his voice uncertain. "May I?" She gestured to the empty chair beside her. "Have a seat." He did. For a long while neither spoke. The sound of rain filled the silence. Finally, Finch cleared his throat. "I wanted to see you, to say." He paused, the words sticking. "What I said that night, I can't take it back, but I can learn from it." Didn't look up from the drone. "You already did, sir." He frowned. "I don't think I have." "You saluted," she said quietly. "That's more than most would done." He chuckled sadly. "That wasn't for me, that was for you." She looked at him then, eyes calm. "No, it was for every soldier you never saw until that moment." Finch inhaled slowly. letting the truth of that settle. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You know, I spent my whole life chasing perfection, the right posture, the right words, the right uniform. I thought that's what made a leader. He paused. But when I saw you standing there in that worn-out uniform, I realized I'd never actually understood strength. Smiled faintly, not out of pride but understanding. You don't need to understand it, sir. Just see it when it's in front of you. He nodded slowly. I see it now. They sat in silence again. Resumed her work, reassembling the drone piece by piece, her hands steady and methodical. You still build things? Finch asked after a while. When I can, she said. It keeps my head quiet. What's that one for? Therapy program, she said. We teach new vets to build small devices. Helps with coordination, focus. Some of them have tremors, anxiety. The small work helps. Finch watched her hands move, calm, patient, deliberate. He thought about the words she'd said that night. Not everything done in service needs to be seen. He understood now. Service didn't end with discharge. Sometimes it only began afterward. At the door he hesitated. Corporal Vance. She looked up. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For reminding me what it means to wear this, he said, gesturing to his own chest, and for showing me how easily we forget. Her gaze softened. Just try not to forget again, sir. He smiled sadly. I won't. And for the first time in years, he meant it. Later that evening, Finch found himself back at the Memorial Plaza downtown. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick, reflecting the city lights. He walked to the wall, engraved with thousands of names. Some were famous, most were not. He placed his palm against the cold stone and whispered, I met one of yours today. Then quietly, he stood at attention. No audience, no ceremony. Just a man remembering what he'd almost lost, humility. Meanwhile, across town, finished locking up the workshop. The veterans had gone home, the benches empty now except for the hum of a few unfinished projects. She wiped her hands, checked her tools, then reached for her jacket. As she did, something fell from the pocket, a small folded piece of paper. It wasn't hers. She unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was neat, military style. Corporal Vance, I've been asked to deliver this by order of the Department of Defense Records Office. Ray, Operation Resolute. Her breath caught. It wasn't official. There were no seals, no signatures, just a single paragraph typed unsigned. For actions taken during Operation Resolute, Objective Griffin, your service is hereby acknowledged with full honors. The mission will remain classified, but your contribution is recognized among those who know. The coin you carry remains your citation. Below it, a single handwritten line. You didn't need the medal, but we needed the reminder. J.M. She smiled faintly. Miller. The next day stood at the Veterans Garden, a small space behind the center where flowers grew between steel and stone. She held the coin between her fingers, running her thumb over the engraved word again. Resolute. Still with me, she whispered. Then she set it down gently among the flowers, half buried in the soil, not as a loss, but as release. The past didn't need to be erased, just finally laid to rest. That evening Miller called. His voice came through calm but warm. Heard the colonel stop by. He did, she said. How'd it go? He's learning, she said. That's enough. He chuckled. Maybe I'll stop by next week. The team's talking about starting a mentorship program for female vets. You'd be perfect to lead it. She laughed softly. I think I've had enough leading for one lifetime. You'd be surprised who needs you now. A pause, then she said quietly, maybe. Take care, Corporal. You too, Lieutenant. When the call ended, sat by the window again. Outside, the city was quiet, not silent, but alive in a gentler way. She thought of the ballroom, of the colonel's salute, of the hundreds of eyes that had finally seen her, not as a soldier or a symbol, but as something more human. And she realized something. It had never been about being recognized. It was about being remembered, not by the many, but by the few who truly understood. That night she wrote a short note and pinned it to the photograph of her old team. It read, "For the ones who stayed and for the ones who never left, you made me resolute, always." Then she turned off the light. Outside, the flag at the Veterans Center fluttered once, catching the glow of a not proud, not perfect, just steady. Like her. Sometimes redemption doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it walks quietly beside regret, teaching it to kneel. And sometimes the strongest salutes are not raised in grand halls, but in quiet rooms, between those who finally understand what respect really means. To be continued, Part 7 will bring the emotional convergence, mentoring new veterans, Miller's return, and the final reflection that ties duty, humility, and memory into a poetic closing. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, next 1,500 plus words? Focusing on slow healing through mentorship, Miller's reappearance, and the soft, poetic build-up to the story's final moral conclusion. You said 7. ChatGPT said. Here is Part 7, 1500 plus words, of your cinematic, voiceover-ready story. The colonel laughed at her uniform until a SEAL lieutenant's salute stunned everyone. This part deepens the calm after the storm's quiet new life, her reluctant step into mentorship, and the soft rebirth of purpose. The tone is reflective, intimate, almost meditative, like a heartbeat slowing after years of tension. Cinematic voiceover script, Part 7. What happens when a soldier runs out of wars? For Vance, it wasn't victory that ended the fight. It was peace, strange, unfamiliar, hard to trust. Weeks had passed since the gala. The world had already moved on, headlines replaced, photos forgotten. But inside the Veterans Center, the rhythm of her days stayed the same. Coffee before sunrise, workshop by 8, silence until noon. She liked it that way. Repetition was safety. It made the noise in her head quiet down. But peace, she was learning, could be its own kind of battle. One morning, as sunlight spilled across the workshop tables, the door opened and a young woman stepped in. She wore civilian clothes but carried herself like someone trying to remember how to stand at attention. "Ma'am," she said awkwardly, "they said you could help." Looked up from her workbench. "With what?" The girl hesitated, her eyes wet. "With not feeling like I'm still there." Set her tools down slowly. She'd seen that look before, in mirrors, in teammates, in ghosts. She nodded to the chair beside her. "Sit." The girl did. And for the next hour didn't talk about therapy or trauma or tactics. She just asked questions, the right ones. The ones that let silence do the work. When the girl finally left, shoulders lighter, stayed staring at the empty chair. The workshop smelled of oil and solder and rain. But beneath it, faintly, something else lingered: purpose. That evening, Miller called again. "You still dodging the press?" he asked. She smiled. "They'll get bored eventually." "They already did," he said. "But the colonel didn't. He's been visiting units, talking about humility and leadership. Uses your name like a ghost story." Laughed softly. "Good, maybe someone will listen." There was a pause, then Miller said, "You know, I meant what I said about the mentorship program. We're setting it up, female vets, small teams, real training. They need someone who understands both sides of the wire." She hesitated. "You really think I'm the right person for that?" "I don't think," he said simply. "I know." 2 days later, walked into a room full of young faces, men and women, barely older than she'd been when she first put on a uniform. They stood awkwardly when she entered, expecting speeches, rules, a checklist. but she just looked around and said quietly, "I'm not here to teach you how to be soldiers. I'm here to remind you you're already human." They didn't understand at first, but over time, through shared silences, through laughter that started hesitant and grew easier, they began to. She taught them small things: how to breathe when the world felt too loud, how to build something steady when their hands wouldn't stop shaking, how to talk about the people they'd lost without breaking apart. And slowly, piece by piece, the fractures in her own armor began to close. One night, after a long session, sat outside the center with Miller. He dropped by to check on the program, but mostly, she suspected, to check on her. The sky was overcast, heavy with summer rain. They sat on the steps, sharing a thermos of coffee that had gone cold. "You've changed," he said finally. "Everyone changes." "No," he said, shaking his head. "You used to look like you were still over there. Tonight you look like you're here." She smiled faintly. "Maybe I finally stopped fighting it." "Stopped fighting what?" "The idea that surviving means starting over." He nodded slowly. "That's the hardest mission of all." They sat in silence, listening to the rain begin to fall, gentle, rhythmic, the kind of sound that fills the space between words. Inside, one of her trainees, the young woman from that first day, peeked through the glass. She saw laughing at something Miller said, a sound rare and small but real. The girl smiled to herself. Because if she could laugh again, maybe they all could. Weeks passed into months. The mentorship program grew. Word spread not through headlines but through whispers, through stories told quietly from one veteran to another. "You should meet her," they'd say. "The woman from Resolute. She doesn't talk about it, but she listens like she's been there." Never corrected them. She didn't need to. They didn't come for her story. They came for what her silence meant. One evening, near closing, the door creaked open again. This time it wasn't a stranger. Colonel Finch stepped in, rain still glistening on his shoulders. His uniform looked simpler now, no medals, just the basic blues. "Evening, Corporal," he said. She turned, smiling. "Colonel, twice in one lifetime, that's rare." He chuckled. "I wanted to show you something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small black box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a silver coin identical to hers. The same word engraved across it, Resolute. Blinked, confused. "Where did you get that?" "They made it," he said. "For every officer in my division. I told them it was a reminder of what real leadership looks like." She stared at it for a long time. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," he said. "That's why I did." He placed it on the table. "You started something you'll never see the end of, Corporal, but you should know you changed us." She didn't answer. She just nodded, eyes soft. Later that night, after he left, she sat alone in the dim light, the two coins, hers and his, side by side. Old and new, faded and shining. Time and memory reflected back at each other. The next morning, Miller visited again. He walked into the workshop and found teaching a group of veterans how to fly small recon drones, just for fun, though the precision in her hands made it look like art. When she noticed him, she raised an eyebrow. "You checking up on me again?" "Just visiting an old comrade," he said, "and maybe stealing coffee." She handed him a mug. "It's cold." He grinned. "Wouldn't be military if it was." They sat in the corner, watching the trainees laugh as one of the drones bumped into a ceiling beam and fell with a soft thud. Miller leaned back, arms folded. "You ever think about going back? Teaching, maybe. Officer Academy could use someone like you." She shook her head. "No, my fight's not there anymore." He nodded slowly. "Then where is it?" "Here," she said simply. "In this room, in these hands." She gestured toward the veterans, one fixing the drone, another helping steady a trembling grip. "This," she said quietly, "is what comes after service." Later that evening, after everyone had gone and Miller walked outside, The sun was setting, that golden, fleeting light that turns everything soft. He stopped by his car, looked back at her. You know, for a woman who didn't want recognition, you've built a legacy. She smiled faintly. It's not mine. It belongs to everyone who stood where I stood and didn't get to walk away. Miller nodded. Maybe, but you carried it here. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she said, you ever wonder why we survive when others do? He looked out at the horizon, every day. And I think maybe it's because someone has to tell the story right. His eyes glistened, reflecting the last light of dusk. Then we tell it right. That night after he left, she sat once more by her window, the same seat she'd taken so many times before. But the silence felt different now. It wasn't emptiness, it was calm. She looked at the two coins on the table, side by side, and whispered, maybe peace isn't the absence of battle. Maybe it's learning how to stop fighting yourself. Outside, the city's lights blinked on one by one. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of an anthem drifted through an open window, soft, reverent, familiar. Closed her eyes and listened. And for the first time since Helmand, the sound didn't hurt. It healed. What remains after the war is over. Not medals, not speeches. Just echoes and the people who choose to listen. The Veterans Center was quiet that morning. Sunlight slipped through the blinds, falling in soft lines across the worn tables. Dust drifted through the beams like smoke from another lifetime. Stood near the wall of photos, the memory line, as they called it. Black and white portraits of soldiers, engineers, medics, pilots. Some smiling, some not. Every frame a heartbeat that had once belonged to someone still trying to come home. She traced her fingers along one of the photos, Sergeant Hale. Beneath it, a simple plaque read, "We remember you by what we became after you were gone." She closed her eyes. It was strange, she thought, how the living were always the ones learning from the dead. Miller's voice echoed behind her. "They're asking if you'll speak at the ceremony next week." She turned, smiling faintly. "And what exactly am I supposed to say?" "Anything you want," he said, "or nothing at all, they just want you there." Looked back at the wall. "You know I don't like standing on stages." "Then don't," he said softly. "Just stand near it, you've earned that much." She didn't answer right away. She was thinking about the last time she'd stood under that kind of light, in the ballroom, surrounded by polished uniforms and practiced smiles. How her silence had said more than 100 speeches ever could. Maybe this time, she thought, silence would be enough again. Later that afternoon, walked outside to the garden. The same small patch of green where she'd buried the Resolute coin months ago. The flowers had grown tall now, red poppies and white lilies, standing quietly in the autumn air. She knelt, brushing the soil gently. Her fingers found the faint edge of metal beneath the roots. She didn't dig it up. She just smiled, tracing the spot once before standing again. "Stay there," she whispered. "You're home now." That evening, Miller and Finch arrived together, an unlikely pair, but one bound now by something deeper than protocol. Finch's hair had gone grayer since she'd last seen him, his posture softer, less rigid. He nodded to her as they approached. "We wanted to give you something." Miller handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, a document, official letterhead, clean typeface, but different from before. She read it quietly. Then again. Then once more, slower. "By order of the United States Department of Defense, the following record amendment is hereby approved. Operation Resolute, Objective Griffin. In recognition of humanitarian distinction and valor in the field. Recognition granted to Corporal Vance, Tactical Communications and Field Operations Specialist, for service exceeding duty." Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Finch cleared his throat softly. "You were right, Corporal. Some things shouldn't stay hidden forever." She looked up, eyes glistening. I didn't do it for this. I know, he said, that's why it matters. The ceremony came a week later. Not a ballroom this time, not a stage or a crowd dressed in ribbons and shine. Just a simple open-air event in the Veterans Garden. Families, soldiers, empty chairs for those who couldn't be there. When arrived, wearing her old uniform, the one still patched, still faded, the whispers started again. But not of mockery, of memory. Miller stood nearby, hands folded behind his back. Finch, in his plain blues, stood off to the side, his head bowed slightly. A young woman stepped up to the microphone. The same girl had helped months ago. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied as she spoke. I was told healing doesn't happen in silence, she said, but it was silence that saved me, the kind of silence that listens, that sees you before you even speak. She looked at, smiling softly. She doesn't call herself a hero, but she became one the moment she decided to come home and still serve, just differently. Applause followed, gentle, real. Then the girl did something no one expected. She turned to, stood at attention, and saluted. One by one, the others followed, veterans, civilians, soldiers, until 100 hands were raised, quiet and steady under the morning sun. Miller's eyes met. He nodded once. Looks familiar, doesn't it? Exhaled slowly. Yeah, but this time it feels lighter. When it was over, she didn't linger. No cameras, no interviews, no fanfare. She just walked back to the garden, to the same patch of earth where the flowers grew thick around the buried coin. She crouched down, rested her hand against the soil, and closed her eyes. The world around her faded, the chatter, the noise, even the soft hum of applause still echoing behind her. In that stillness, she heard it again. That sound from years ago, in the darkness of Helmand. The whisper that had kept her alive. I'm still here. That night, the Veterans Center stayed open late. Miller was still there, talking with some of the new recruits. Finch had already left quietly without a word. Stood by the window again, city lights stretching out before her. But this time, she wasn't looking for meaning in them. She was just watching them be, alive, imperfect, constant. On the desk behind her sat the new citation, untouched. Beside it, the twin coins. Her own and Finch. One old, one new. Both earned the same way, through humility learned too late. She finally sat down and began writing. Not a report, not a letter. Just words for herself. There is no such thing as former service. The mission doesn't end when the gunfire stops. It continues every time we choose to help someone find their way home, even if we're still finding ours. She paused, letting the ink dry, then added a final line. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. The next morning the workshop buzzed again, laughter, drills, clinking tools. Moved among them, calm, steady, the way a tide moves through the shore. When the young woman she'd mentored once asked, "Do you ever miss it? The uniform, the mission, the command?" Just smiled and said, "This is the mission." As the day ended, she walked outside again, toward the flagpole that stood beside the garden. The sun was setting, painting everything in amber and gold. She raised her hand slowly, one last salute. Not for rank, not for recognition, but for everyone who ever stood unseen and unthanked. Her arm lowered, her shoulders eased. And then finally, she let herself breathe. Somewhere far away, on a windswept base where the desert met the horizon, a young soldier stared at the night sky and whispered the words written on her coin, Resolute. He didn't know her name. He didn't need to. He just knew someone had once stood where he stood now, and refused to break. And that was enough. Narrator's final words, soft, reflective, almost a whisper. We measure strength in medals, but it's often found in silence. We think courage is the moment before the shot, but sometimes it's the moment after. when you choose to keep living, and when history forgets the names, when the applause fades, there will always be someone who remembers the quiet ones, the ones who stood their ground, took the ridicule, and answered not with anger, but with grace. Because sometimes the loudest sound a soldier can make is dignity itself.